How's it going, everybody? Greg here, Greg Arias Media, here with another episode of Discog Devil, where I go over the worst and best of an artist's discography. This week, we're going to go over the Celtic rock band from Toronto, Canada, Enter The Haggis. Founded in 1995 by Craig Downey, who is the only original member in the current lineup, Enter The Haggis are known for their blend of Celtic rock, traditional folk rock, roots rock, and indie rock. They also have a little bit of crossover potential into more heavier, even harder rock territory, depending on the certain songs such as No Stones, Death of Johnny Morning, even arguably a little bit of punk with Litter and the Leaves, but that's primarily because of its really fast tempo. Enter the Haggis have a very accessible sound. The band got a lot more popular in 2003 when they played a show for 20,000 people for the Mayor's Cup in New York. And since then, they have been huge on the festival staples, and their albums, since Casualties of Retail, have only gotten more and more popular. They briefly changed their name in 2014 to Jubilee Riots, showing a shift in sound, pretty much getting rid of most of the Celtic influences and focusing more on the traditional roots rock and folk rock elements of their influences, while also going in a slight bit more of a pop rock direction. The Jubilee Riots era really only lasted about a year, because in late 2015 they switched it back to Enter the Haggis and even released a new EP, Broken Arms, in 2016. Each album has sort of showed a certain progression in a certain trajectory. Some albums are a little bit poppier than others, some are a little bit more of a rootsier, sort of even more contemporary one than others, and some are more diverse than others. Each album always comes with a level of execution and variety that always surprises me. And I don't really dislike any one of these albums I'm going to list, but it's very, very obvious that some are stronger than others, and I will attempt to justify my opinion in this video. So from worst to best, this is Discog Devil, Enter the Haggis. Let's go! At the bottom of this list, we have Let the Winds Blow High, which is the only album that featured Rob Rodent McCready on vocals. Also note that this is the only album that actually prominently features the Haggis Head logo, and it took me a while to actually acknowledge that this was a real album, because I look at the album cover compared to the other ones, and then I also have to remember that this is 1998 when this was released, so probably on a budget. This album definitely has much more of a Celtic-centric sound, but it's not like as if there weren't any forms of alternative or indie rock in the mix. There were definitely some songs on here that I think really showcased where Enter the Haggis would eventually go. This is like a good baseline of where they started. Songs such as Donald, Where's Your Trousers, or as Rob says on here, Trousers. If I remember correctly, the song is pretty much drinking and pretty much getting blackout drunk and then waking up to realize you don't have pants. It's kind of a funny song. There's also the song Sky Swimmer that I thought was really cool, and to be perfectly honest, those are the only ones I'm kind of remembering off the top of my head, and I feel bad for not writing down any of the songs in my notes that I'm looking at, but unfortunately this album is just not that memorable. It's not bad, but it's definitely not what you would go to listen to for Enter the Haggis for. Rob isn't a bad vocalist by any means, but his accent is very, very clear and up front. This is definitely a different era of Enter the Haggis. This really does sound like more of a Celtic band than a Celtic rock band. Before making this list, it was honestly the first time I ever had listened to this album, and I listened to it at least 5 or 6 times before really concluding where to put it on this list, because I wanted to put it a little higher, but I just couldn't. I couldn't remember really any of the other songs on here. The songwriting was at its early stages. It was much more Celtic-centric as opposed to the additional influences of folk rock and indie rock and even some more pop and contemporary elements that would show up later. Overall, this album, I don't have that much to say on it. It's the only one that actually has the Haggis Head logo on it, which is kind of weird in my opinion. This album, I don't think is really that relevant in the Enter the Haggis canon, because I don't really recognize any of these songs ever being played live. Maybe like an instrumental or two, but I don't listen to Enter the Haggis primarily for the instrumentals. This album is low on the list because I honestly don't remember jack shit about it for the most part. And if I had to listen to it multiple times and still can't remember it, that's a problem. Next on this list we have Aerials, which was released in either 2001 or 2002. I'd say either of those years because Wikipedia says 2002, but I've also read in other places that it was released in 2001. And to be perfectly honest, it took me a long time to find this album. I actually reached out to Enter the Haggis on Facebook directly to see if whoever was running the page could maybe give me some insight as to where to find this album and if it actually exists, because looking on YouTube, there are a couple tracks from it that are posted online, but not the entire album. And there's no presence of it on Spotify. So I Googled it, and while you can't find it anywhere on the actual website, it is on Enter the Haggis' official page, but it's hidden. So the only way that I found that you could access it is if you type in Ariel's full album on Google, and it will actually link you to the album if you want to stream it. Other than that, I don't know where the hell you're going to find it. If you're on the Enter the Haggis page itself, you're not going to find it. This is the first album that is closer to the modern lineup. The sound is definitely a good stepping stone as to where Enter the Haggis would progress in later albums. It has much more of a catchiness to it. It does have much more of an influence of folk and indie rock in the mix. In fact, some songs on here are almost strictly indie and alternative sounding, with songs such as Andromeda, December Ends, and Half an Hero, pretty much taking more of an indie influence over Celtic. The main issue I have with this particular album is the amount of instrumentals there are on here. I enjoy Enter the Haggis a lot, but a lot of my enjoyment comes from their combination of the instrumental palette as well as the vocal harmonies, because that is a key signature factor, especially when you consider the more recent Enter the Haggis albums. So with this to have, oh god, how many instrumentals? At least 4 or 5 instrumentals. It kind of lost my attention pretty quick. On top of the fact that this was kind of more of a stepping stone moment in their songwriting toward where they would eventually progress, a lot of the instrumentals on here are just kind of bland. Or strictly instrumentals, I should say, are bland. The stuff with actual vocal melodies are okay. But a lot of them are not super strong. The big finale song, Icarus, which is the longest song I think they've ever recorded at 8 minutes long, is a standout, and I wish they played this live, or if they do, then it wasn't the last time I saw them. God damn it. It's a sweeping 8-minute, very Celtic influenced track that just sounds like you're on an adventure. And that's sort of one thing I really enjoy about Enter the Haggis, is the fact that a lot of these songs, while they can sound very, contemporary and smooth and kind of relaxing at times, when they get really energetic, it sounds like you're just on the most epic adventure. And Icarus is nothing short of that. I just wish I could stream it more often, but they don't have it on fucking Spotify. This album's good. It's just not great. That's about all I can say. I understand I'll probably get a little bit of shit for where Casualties of Retail sits on my list, but if you listen to my complaints of Aerials, then you probably can understand why Casualties of Retail is at number 6. The instrumentals are still kinda boring. Not all of them, but there's still 4 instrumentals on a 12-track album. There are 2 back-to-back. One of the main reasons I listen to Enter the Haggis is not only with the instrumental palette, but also the vocal harmonies layered on top. Otherwise, I'm listening to some kind of cool Celtic rock instrumentals, and that's just, for me, not the go-to listening. This does step up the formula quite a bit, and in fact, some of the more recognizable songs in their catalog are on here, such as Another Round, Gasoline, and Down with a Ship, usually being a closer for most of their live shows, or at least the ones that I've seen. I think this is where a lot of people started listening to Enter the Haggis, especially after their Mayor's Ball show in 2003. This was released in 2005. They definitely had much more of a following going into this album as opposed to the previous two. But yeah, having 5 instrumentals on this album, kind of not my thing. And this is really more of just a personal take, because otherwise a lot of these songs on here are goddamn fantastic. I actually kind of lied. I'm looking at my notes, and yeah, I think Minstrel Boy and She Moved Through the Fair aren't exactly super interesting tracks. Haven or Life for Love are decent, but they're not exactly memorable. On top of the fact that you have 5 other instrumentals, that there's only one that I really like, which is Congress. I think that one has a really super nice build with a Celtic-centric sound that is just a fucking earworm. I'd say Twirling for Freedom is actually pretty good also. It's one of the heavier ones, but I would prefer with those type of songs to actually have some vocal layers over them. I think I would have enjoyed them a lot better in that regard. This is a good step in the right direction, and there are some great songs on here, but there's a lot that just don't really match up to later albums. Sorry, Casualties of Retail, you're still at 6. At the number 5 spot, we have White Lake, which was released in 2011. This album is noted for being a sonic shift for the band, where the bagpipes, the more Celtic-centric sound, sort of took a backseat more in favor of focusing on the more folk and rootsier influences of their formula, and which kind of led to some mixed results for some fans. Some fans thought that this was sort of abandoning the sound a little too much. Some just thought that the experimentation didn't quite hit, and I'm sort of in between there, but I still find a lot of highlights off this album, and I think some really underrated cuts. The album actually opens up pretty well with Headlights 1 and 2. I think it has a really cool build at the start, with Headlights 1 being sort of a slower song, and then the second part where the tempo picks up and all the instruments start speeding up, and it has this really great vocal harmony layering toward the end, and it's just fantastic. Basket or the Blade follows it up, and it is a fantastically catchy piano-driven track, and it does have the bagpipes on it. It definitely has that Celtic rock sound, but it has much more of a piano-driven sound. It just sounds like one of those awesome adventure type of songs that I listen to Enter the Haggis for. And it's very catchy, it's not super heavy and in your face, but it's this really cool kind of lay back and sort of imagine yourself and immerse sort of into the soundscape sort of song. And it's just really, really nice. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce this song, so I'm just going to put it on the screen. But this song is another solid cut with more of a folk-focused sound, and it has a breakdown section that has a cool vocal trade-off, trade-off between the violin and a more crunching guitar sound. The Flood is a sort of minimalist ballad focusing more on violin and acoustic guitar, and some nice little piano notes toward the end, and it's just a really, really nice song, despite the depressing backstory that it was inspired when Brian nearly drowned recording the album. Good thing you survived, buddy. A White Squall is a cover of a Stan Rogers song, and I think it's actually a really great way to end the album. It's super catchy, the vocal harmonies are great, and toward the end, as with many Enter the Haggis songs that we know that are really long, have this really great build toward the end that just explodes. With that being said, there are a couple songs that I don't really care for off this album. Getaway Car is one that's been played on the alternative radio station up here in Maine, but it really just kind of lacks personality. It kind of just sounds like any other generic indie rock band in the early 2010s. I honestly didn't even recognize it was an Enter the Haggis song until I listened very, very closely to the vocal harmonies, and that was the only real distinct characteristic. But it took me forever to actually recognize it, because the instrumental palette on that song is just boring as fuck. And then also Follow and Let Me Go are some decent indie rock, folk rock sort of songs, but overall, they're just kind of meh. I do appreciate this album for what it is, though. It does sort of have Enter the Haggis step away from their Celtic roots while not completely abandoning them, but they do sort of take a different approach to their songwriting that I think overall does work. A lot of the songs I think are catchy, and I think the way in which the instrumentation is approached is worked very well and tastefully. This album does contain its faults, but I think it has more strengths than it does faults. I'd still highly recommend this album from start to finish. This is the Jubilee Riots record, Penny Black, released in 2014. As I said earlier in the video, they did change their name to Jubilee Riots briefly because they wanted to sort of stray away from the sort of Celtic influences that they were known for, because it just wasn't their interest at the time. They wanted to do something a little more rootsy, they wanted to do something a little bit more folkish and indie, and that's pretty much what this album does. As I actually see this album, it's kind of a continuation of the experimentation from White Lake, but I think just executed a little bit better. A lot of songs are very catchy, definitely a little bit on the poppier end, but the way that it's done, I think, is just perfectly fine in that regard. There's even a little bit of gospel angles on some of these songs. It definitely has more of a soulful tone than I think any of the other Enter the Haggis albums do. This is definitely something that I wouldn't recommend as a first listen if you don't know Enter the Haggis' sound, because this is definitely not going to be recognizable. This is definitely a Jubilee Riots album, but because it is in the Enter the Haggis canon, I'm kind of stammering, but I think you get my point. Trying Times is the opening song on here, and it opens up with these really catchy piano notes, and the chorus is just infectious as fuck. And then toward the end of the song, you have this really big choir swell, and the rhythm picks up, and it's like really fucking catchy. Two Bare Hands is one of the more popular and catchier moments on the album. President's Shoes is also a highlight on here. Traveler and Lived a Life are probably as close to the traditional Enter the Haggis sound as you're going to find on this album, and because it has more of that adventurous sort of tone. Even then, it's still very much different, I'd say. You couldn't really just pick those songs out and throw them on any Enter the Haggis album. Ashtray opens up with this oh night, oh night, oh night, oh robot, oh night, oh night sort of chant that I really did not expect when I first heard this album. It actually scared the shit out of me, because I had the album kind of loud when I was playing it, and when that opened up, I kind of flew out of my seat. But it leads into a soulful and slightly Celtic-y tinged sound, and song plays on as a closer is an absolute fucking earworm. The horn line is just which is then followed by a funky verse and a very, chant, sing-along chorus. It's incredible. It's definitely a moment in Enter the Haggis' catalog, a Jubilee Riots moment. It's still a very interesting album that I think takes the experimentation that they were going for on White Lake, and I think just executes it even better. For the bronze, we have The Modest Revolution, released in 2013. This album, I guess, is supposed to be a concept album of sorts. I think it's more thematical, but essentially, let me look at my notes here. This album was inspired by a newspaper called the Globe and Mail. This album was after a Kickstarter campaign in July of 2012, and which succeeded its 20,000 mark. This album follows up White Lake, and it opens up pretty obviously with a more Celtic-centric style. I think the songwriting here sort of takes the ambition that they were going for on White Lake and just threw that ambition into their traditional formula, and I think makes for one of their best albums. The 1-2 punch of Year of the Rat and Can't Trust the News. Year of the Rat opens up with this super nice guitar riff, and then Can't Trust the News is just this super catchy horn driven, or opens up with this really nice horn line. Both songs are very, very solid. Down the Line is very much a more of a stomping kind of folk rock kind of track, but it has more of a crunch to it with the guitar distortion, and toward the end it just has this really solid breakdown that So good. Balto is easily one of the catchiest Celtic pop songs I've heard this decade. It definitely has this very super adventurous tone, and it's just hyper catchy vocal melodies. Letters is probably my favorite track on here, which has sort of like a two song combined as one approach, where the first half is much more of this kind of ballady acoustic guitar driven track, and then in the second half it builds and builds into this instrumental, just luscious instrumental sort of explosion with this really super nice horn line after the vocals fade away. Copper Leaves is probably the most contemporary track I think I could find on this album. It has the very trademark vocal harmonies, has the poppiest sort of sound out of the entire album, which honestly I think this could have been pretty big considering 2013 was at the time of, I think, the Lumineers. Mumford & Sons were still pretty big at that time. I'm pretty sure Copper Leaves could have easily came over here and not fucking Getaway Car. Blackout is a really great rock song, and then Up in Lights is probably one of the best closing tracks that they have on any album. It's pretty mellow, has a really nice build up toward the 3-minute mark, and then sort of just gently fades away as it's built up, and it's just a really beautiful track. This album is, I think, what Enter the Haggis does best. Makes very catchy Celtic influenced pop songs with a very rock tinge to it, and there's nothing to complain about that. For the silver, we have the 2006 release Soapbox Heroes. This album is just 10 tracks, has only one instrumental, and that's how it opens up with Lancaster Gate, and it's easily one of my favorite all-time instrumentals from Enter the Haggis, if not my favorite instrumental, period, from them. And this, I truly feel, is a Celtic rock classic of an album. This should have been a lot bigger than it was. From the opening, super nice build-up of Lancaster Gate into the super fun, purely Celtic song, One Last Drink, and oh my god, it is such an earworm. Going into New Monthly Flavor, which has much more of a harder guitar riff and is in a 6/4 time. That is just, it's one of the hardest riffs they have, and it builds up into this I hate using explosions as a description, because I feel like I'm just like verbally Michael Baying these albums, but the way that the album, like their sonic build-ups are, it's just like a fucking keg. It's like a fucking keg that just keeps shaking and shaking and shaking and then just bursts, because they know dynamics to a fucking T. The Barfly is pretty much a piano ballad, with, you know, it builds up with some drums and some minimal instrumentation later, but it's a really great storytelling song of a guy who's at a bar and that every old man has a story to tell, and each verse sort of progresses the storyline of sort of how he met his wife, he has a family, and sort of the trials and tribulations after that fact. Really great song that also has this really nice instrumental section that goes into the story, and it is, oh, I cannot do these songs justice. No More Stones is just a fucking banger, and the perfect song is pretty much as the title suggests. It is a goddamn perfect song. The dynamic builds all throughout the song, and it's one of those longer 6-minute tracks, so you know that instrumentally they're not going to fuck around. Going into Marty's Last Stand, which is a cool sort of song that describes a man who was kind of a pacifist, who was thrown into war and who ends up dying and is hailed as a hero. And then Long Way Home is just a really cool, mellow closer. This album, I'm not sure if I can even describe this justice, and that's the problem with these lists, that once I get into the albums I really have high up on this list, I almost get this like lack of confidence in describing how great these albums are. Every single song is catchy as hell and really has the Enter the Haggis signature sound that I feel like should have been bigger. This was around the same time as Dropkick Murphys and Flogging Molly and, you know, bands of the like, And I feel like this could have easily been the alternative. People who still want some of that Celtic rock edge but wasn't like super punk and in your face. This album has the variety of being purely Celtic on a couple songs to being very hard rocking on others, and then all this in between that have these really cool musical moments that I sound like I am bullshitting a paper right now because it sounds like I'm so good, just listen to it. But it's not my number one. This is. Basically think Soapbox Heroes, but with even more variety, more ambition in the songwriting. Gutter Anthems is easily my number one, because fucking A, this thing is amazing. It's 15 tracks. It has, I believe, 3 or 4 short songs, kind of instrumentals, and there is actually one longer instrumental on here, Murphy's Ashes, that are just, Murphy's Ashes is easily, I actually would say Murphy's Ashes is my favorite instrumental because it has this really cool bagpipe line that just builds into this really heavier sort of ending, and it's The Litter in the Leaves is what opens up as the first full song on here after this really beautiful organ and bagpipe led intro, and it is one of the fastest, I think the fastest song they've ever recorded, or at least tempo wise. It's not the shortest song on here, it's actually about 4.5 minutes, and it progressively builds into something that's more anthemic with each and every verse, and actually toward the end it's solely piano in the last, I think, minute of the track, and Brian's just singing about, we will sing our gutter anthems till we die. We are, from the gutter, and we're proud of it. And then you have songs like Cameos that have much more of a rootsier sort of sound. DNA is much more of an indie banger. Death of Johnny Morning is arguably the heaviest song I think Enter the Haggis has ever recorded. Opens up with this massive organ swell and just super distorted guitar, and it's just an anthem. It is a banger. And some of the other poppier moments on here, such as Suburban Plains and Sea of Crutches, which Sea of Crutches is actually much more traditionally Celtic-y sounding, I'd say, in a more pop context. And while those may not be my favorite moments on the album, they're still very great in the context of the entire picture. The final 3 tracks on here are probably one of my favorite, sort of last legs of any album, period. You have The Ghost of Calico, which is another song that has much more of a kind of roots rock sort of start, and then just, again, with the dynamics and sort of instrumental progressions of the song, just build into something fantastic. Lights and Cars is kind of one of the more straightforward, just straight up indie rock tracks with, a little bit of the bagpipe in the back, and it's just catchy as hell. It's wonderful. And Broken Line, first half of the song is just a really cool Celtic rock song, and then just instrumentally just keeps building into this swelling fucking Michael Bay explosion levels of amazing. And unlike Michael Bay, these explosions actually fucking mean something. Man, this album is phenomenal. I wish Enter the Haggis had vinyl of all their albums, specifically this one, because I'd buy it immediately. The thing is with Gutter Anthems, for me, it just showcases their formula and an even more ambitious stage in their songwriting, even more so than Soapbox Heroes, which pretty much was just an even more ambitious progression from Casualties of Retail, which was a build-up from Aerials. Even in moments where some track transitions may not be the most, ear-pleasing, I think that the song quality, it doesn't matter, it's fucking fantastic. This album should have been big. You have songs like Litter in the Leaves, which is just an energetic, anytime I've been at an Enter the Haggis live show, no one is sitting down during this song. You have songs like DNA, which is hyper catchy. The Death of Johnny Morning, which is super heavy. You have Real Life and Alibis, which is one of those 2-part songs that just transitions so well into one another. Murphy's Ashes is one of the best, if not the best, instrumental they've ever recorded. They just have their strongest set of material on this album, from front to back. Even if maybe the track listing, it may not always mesh together from track to track, to me, that's not a problem, because the quality of every single song outweighs some of the little incohesive sort of transition points. Gutter Anthems is my gold. Boom. So that'll do it for this episode of Discog Devil. Let me know what your favorite albums are of Enter the Haggis from worst to best, and if you want to give me shit on why Casualty to Retail is so low on my list, by all means, you are allowed. I'm not a bitch, I don't block people. Yet. Like this video, comment, subscribe, YouTube shtick. And also follow my social media stuff, which is down there in the description. And I'll also provide a playlist of Spotify and whatever albums that they have available of my key 3 songs from each album that I think anyone who hasn't listened to Enter the Haggis should check out. I'm Greg Gregarious Media. See you in the next episode.
Let's get fucking